Well, it is the day after President Biden addressed a joint session of Congress and every American voter Tuesday night as he carried out his constitutional duty and spoke out about the state of our union. It was a speech reshaped dramatically by the last 7 days of conflict in Eastern Europe as Russia invades Ukraine and American forces have been sent to nearby NATO allies to serve as a deterrent. Joining me now live are Republican analyst Karen Roseberry and Sacramento's Democratic Party Chairwoman Tracy Stafford to dig into what the president did have to say. Tracy, let's start with you. Biden went into this with his poll numbers lagging, his domestic agenda undone by members of his own party, and the midterms looming. Did he say anything to bring back the suburban moms and independents who have kind of abandoned him?
Oh, absolutely. That's actually an interesting narrative because I will say there's a lot of support for Joe Biden. And what has been very interesting, his focus is on unifying the country. And that is the reason he was elected president, with support across the aisle. I mean, he has been in office basically for a generation. And that is, and his focus has been for the people. He's working for the people, and he is speaking for the people. And we say that referring to working families, the working class community. And often we leave those folks behind, but it is the vast majority of our country. And that's who he was speaking to about the economy, about schools, education. He covered pretty much everything that folks need to hear to know that he is focused on them and those kitchen table topics, which is what we are all fighting for: the ability to feed our families, the ability to educate our children, to actually be able to hold a job. And we know for a fact that we have seen record-breaking increases in jobs, the most in history, as well as our economy, 5.7%. I mean, we are doing extremely well.
Okay, let's get Karen in here. Did he reach outlying groups or fall into the same pits Republicans would have predicted?
I don't think that he actually hit the mark. I think that he gave some talking points that did try to express some unity. I certainly would agree with that point there. But I think he really missed the mark when it comes to inflation. I think when he spoke about that issue, it didn't address the heart of the issue. It was speaking about, electric cars so that they don't have to pay at the pump. Most Americans, most Californians aren't in a place where that's going to be a reality. And what they're seeing right now is drastic and radical inflation on the things that they buy every day. I think that there's been a lot of money that's been dumped into the economy that has actually seen the rise in those costs that he talked about. It's not about lowering wages. He's correct in that it was a lack of understanding of what actually was driving the inflation and those costs up. And you can't continue to pour the kind of money that has been poured into the economy in and not expect those costs to rise. And the solutions that he was offering and what he was suggesting was not hitting home with those moms, with those folks that are struggling to decide, which necessity they need to buy.
Okay.
And until that inflationary issue gets under control, I think we're going to see a lot of Americans really struggling and really hurting because of it.
All righty, Karen, in reshaping this speech and talking about America's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, President Biden said President Putin has miscalculated the worldwide support he would get for making this move and that there would be triumph over tyranny. Biden announced that the U.S. is closing its airspace to Russian aircraft. Are we doing enough?
Not yet. I think that we actually do need to show an even greater resolve and a greater support for the Ukrainian people. I think that, if there was ever a time where we should be looking at a military response, when there is a bully like Putin who is willing to threaten NATO, when he's willing to threaten a sovereign country, when he's willing to jeopardize democracy, we need to step up our game. And I think that there is a unity that can come from opposing a bully like Putin.
And Tracy, the president's been criticized for not responding to this crisis in Eastern Europe with enough strength. What say you about what he had to say last night?
We believe that he is right on point because basically what he has been working, as well as, of course, the entire administration, with European allies. And they have been at this for quite some time. This is not something that just appeared, just happened. I mean, it's not just the United States. We have allies, over 30 countries that are in support and that are against tyranny and standing up for democracy. And the decision was made to support Kyiv. And my nephew was actually deployed. And this has been happening for months, deploying troops to support Kyiv. And there are other allies who are on the ground in Russia. This is a international effort to save democracy. And he is absolutely right on point.
Okay, now Tracy, defund the police has been a liberal drumbeat over the last 2 years. Last night, the president said there will be no defund the police. That, coupled with his inability to pass new gun restrictions and voting rights legislation, some say this speech was meant to reset Biden with his base as much as anybody else. With not converting on those issues, will the base still back him?
Absolutely. And what I would say is just this whole discussion around defunding the police has been very interesting because the Democratic position has always been to reallocate funding, that our police officers are responding to everything from mental health challenges to actual policing, and that we have other reallocation of funds focused on things that police should not be involved in. So defunding police was not the Democratic message as a whole. And remember, we have a large tent.
Exactly. Okay, Karen, let's get you in on this. Is Biden not courting his own base enough? I mean, there were 2 Democratic responses to the speech of a Democratic president last night, progressives speaking out. I don't think we've seen something like that before.
I think that Biden does have a big task ahead of him because I think that there is a very big tent right now in the Democrat Party where there is a far left contingent that is not going to be happy with a lot of the things that they heard, especially the fund of the police, because, you know, as much as it may not be the entire Democrat Party talking point of defund the police, it was a very distinct talking point. And to now kind of reshape that narrative. I mean, you know, we saw Minneapolis reject it eventually, and that did start to change the narrative and move away from that idea that defund the police was going to have any sort of lasting legacy. I think people realize that we do need our police officers, and certainly, you know, Biden is trying to move to center on that, and it is facing some resistance from the hard left that still wants to hold that position, even if they will maybe use different terminology for it.
All right, ladies, we're going to have to put a pin in it there. So much to talk about. We'll definitely have you back. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here. Appreciate it.